Welcome to the World Chess Championship match, Game 13. The score is currently tied, and we have Gukesh with the white pieces. Gukesh starts with e4, not afraid to play against Ding's French defense. If we remember, Gukesh lost that first game as white playing against black's French defense with e6. So let's see if he came up with something unique or different. We have d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, e5, knight e7, knight e2. All these moves played before, c5, c3, knight c6. And now Gukesh plays a3, and we have bishop to e7. Ding taking some time to think about if he wants to play this position differently. Otherwise, he can be in similar fashion to that first game with a5, a4, b5, something along those lines, and then the knight coming to c4. We do see something similar, but black first playing bishop to e7. We have bishop to e3, knight to b6, knight to f4, takes, and knight to c4. Ding taking a lot of time to play this move knight b6, and I think that what's happening is he's trying to fit his repertoire into the current position. So with this move a3 being played and knight b6, knight like b6 heading into c4, I think Ding is trying to transition the game into something that he knows well with black, something that he studied. It also takes a lot of time with this move as well. So a big problem could potentially be, as we've seen, is that he gets lower and lower on time as the game progresses. After knight to f4, takes, knight c4, takes, and knight to e2. Knight to e2 is quite an interesting move by Gukesh. The most natural square for the knight is on f3, but from f3 it only serves the purpose of guarding the two pawns in the center. With knight to e2, the knight has a lot of flexibility to go to c3 or g3, and then to head into this 4 square. We have pawn to b5 and white castles. Okay, the pawn on c4 is definitely a big weakness, and I was considering that pawn b5 could be, even though Ding played it, could be a potentially poor move because of the move pawn to a4. And you cannot play a6 because of captures, and the rook on a8 falls. However, after the move a4, black can push the pawn to b4 and get these two pawns connected, plus the bishop can come to a6, supporting the pawn but also helping its advance as well, opening up some tactical ideas for black. So Gukesh doesn't try to undermine this queenside pawns with a4. He simply castles. We have castles, knight c3 attacking the pawn on b5, and rook to b8. So both sides have finished the opening, and let's discuss the main plans for each side. In order to get to the plans, we should first talk about the characteristics of the position and some of the most critical details. White has a space advantage in the center and on the king side afforded to him by this e5 advance. This suggests that White's play is on the king side for a possible kingside attack. White has a pawn majority on the king side. We have 5 pawns versus 4, or you could say 1 extra pawn in the center. And White's pawn on d4 is a backwards pawn. It is currently being targeted, and if it moves forwards, it can potentially be captured. This suggests that White is very likely to want to push d5 at the right moment if it is a favorable move in the position. The benefit of also playing d5 is that the bishop on e3 opens up, maybe targeting the pawn on the a7 square. White is missing a light squared bishop, and black has the bishop pair. So the light squares might become weaker and weaker for white as the game goes on. And black's bishop pair might give him an edge if the position opens up. White should aim to keep the position closed and limit black's bishop pair. And the pawns are doing a great job at the moment limiting this dark squared bishop. Okay, what are black's plans? Black has the bishop pair and should make the most out of it. Black wants to open up the position, but it's not exactly clear how at the moment. Black has a queenside pawn majority, which might become useful later in the game. The knight on c6 has a potentially very strong square on b3, or even on d3 if it can get there. The pawn on a7 could become a target, so it's likely black plays a6, or maybe even a5 followed by b4. Gukesh plays the move knight to h5, going for a direct kingside attack. We have pawn to f5, stopping the idea of queen g4 with an attack against g7. The question here is, do you take the pawn en passant or not? Gukesh takes on f6. With this move, he claims that although he loses his space advantage, what's left is this weak pawn on e6. If you try to continue the kingside attack otherwise by playing the move g4, hoping that black takes, the problem with this move is your king is getting seriously weakened, and if the bishop and queen work together on this diagonal, it could be disastrous for white. So pawn takes on f6, bishop takes on f6, attacking the pawn, and queen to f3 is played, targeting the knight on c6. There are some very interesting tactics when I was analyzing this position. The big question is, can the knight take on d4? And after knight takes, just to show some interesting lines for black, knight takes on d4, knight takes on f6 check. If queen takes on f6, we just eliminate the queen and the bishop falls. But if rook takes on f6, attacking the queen has this move queen g3. And the rook on b8 is under attack. The bishop on e3 is targeting the knight on d4, and this could cause serious problems. So I think Ding in this position didn't go for this move knight takes on d4 because this idea of queen g3. However, if we go a little bit further, black has this move, two options here, surprisingly. The first option is more direct with the move bishop to b7. A very, very human, I should say, with the idea of rook to g6, putting pressure on the g2 pawn, and the queen defends the rook on b8. But the problem in this position is that bishop d4 happens, and the queen cannot take because of rook falls on b8. However, Ding, I think, missed this move in the game, which is the move knight to f3 check. Very surprising move. And the point is that if the pawn takes, then rook g6 pins the queen to the king. A really wild tactic to see in the position. So after queen f3, the knight is under attack, and we have queen to e8, defending the knight on c6 and putting some pressure on the knight on h5. We have knight takes and rook takes. This change results in the following. Black no longer has the bishop pair, and we have opposite colored bishops. The e6 pawn is weak, and the d4 pawn is weak. Black still maintains this queenside pawn majority. If white can target and win this pawn on e6, white will have significant winning chances. If black can trade all the pieces off and just leave the two bishops on the board, then black will have easy drawing chances. We have the move queen to e2, queen to g6. Here we have pawn to f3. Pawn to f3 is quite a strong move. The pawn is enabling the knight to be able to come to the e4 square and potentially c5. In addition to that, after bishop e7, this diagonal is a little bit reduced. After rook to f8, we have rook to d1, and black plays knight to e7, also a very nice move, improving the knight, either trying to head to the f5 square or the d5 square, and also giving the potential for the knight not to be vulnerable on the c6 square. We have bishop to f4, an amazing move by Gukesh. The point is that you cannot take the bishop on f4 because of queen to e5. The rook has to move and goes to b6. We have bishop to c7, rook to b7, and bishop d6, stopping the knight from going to d5 or f5, and rook to e8. This is the critical moment, and this is Gukesh's chance to play for an edge in the position. The real big question is, should we take the knight on e7? If we can take the knight on e7, then we have a situation potentially where you have a good knight versus bad bishop scenario. What makes it a bad bishop is that the pawns are on light squares, and the black bishop is unable to target white's pawns on the dark squares. In addition to that, the knight can come to this nice square on c5, always putting pressure on the pawn on e6 and stopping the bishop from going to either d7 or b7. So from an endgame point of view, it could very well favor Gukesh to go into this trade. And given the match situation and standing, he wouldn't be really taking any risks with this trade. So is Gukesh going to play strategically here, or is he going to find something more concrete? In the previous games, we saw Gukesh fail to play strategically, but try and attempt to play very concretely and fail to win. So in this game, Gukesh plays bishop takes on e7. And although he's playing extremely strategically with this move, the engine doesn't like it, and it was better to keep this strong bishop on the board, exerting pressure on the queen side and on the king side, and the best move was just the simple move rook to e1, and after a5, for example, bishop c5, the bishop stands better than either the knight or the bishop, and white can still play for this knight e4, knight d6 idea. So an interesting moment, and unfortunate that Gukesh couldn't find that most precise hit with bishop c5, or just this idea of bringing the rook to the center and avoiding the bishop for knight trade, which, by the way, is a strategically correct decision. You cannot lose the game after this trade. So bishop takes, rook takes, queen to e5, hitting the pawn, and pawn to a6. White clearly has the advantage, and how should white continue? Well, you really don't want to play the move d5, trading off the pawn on e6, which is a clear weakness. But then again, d5 tactically might work at some moment if the rook on b7 ever moves. The knight on e4 could definitely improve to the knight on c3 could improve to e4 and c5, which seems like the most logical plan. And the best move according to the computer here was h4, trying to grab space on the king side, followed by like rook to e1 or knight to e4 or rook to e4, rook to g4, maintaining the control over e5 and also limiting this light squared bishop. And Gukesh now decides to play concretely, and he plays the move d5. There's nothing inherently wrong with this move, and it's just interesting that it's something consistent in his game where you have the option to play strategically, which he just went into with bishop takes e7, and then he switches to play a move d5, which is extremely concrete. Now, the move is actually a very strong move, depending on if you follow it up with perfect play, which Gukesh will see if he's able to do. So d5, from my perspective, the e5 square is under white's complete control. The rook on e7 is super passive. The bishop on c8 is very passive. I would never play the move d5 unless I had some very clear concrete reason. Otherwise, there's a lot of simple moves that you could play quite easily and quite comfortably. Rook e1, knight e4. These moves can be played pretty much without any calculation, and they're improving moves. So d5 is played. Let's see what Gukesh had in mind. We have captures, queen takes with check, queen to e6, queen to c5. The threat in the position is rook to e1. The threat in the position is also rook to d8. We have rook to e8, covering the back row, and rook to e1, bringing the other rook to the e file. Ding plays the move queen f7, and he could have gone for this, but it's very unlikely that he would have gone for this with the bishop hanging and the potential for the knight to give all sorts of potential threats. It's not a human move to make, and especially with 8 minutes left on the timer, queen to f7, a very natural move here. Not the best move according to the computer. We have knight to e4, and this is Gukesh's idea. He calculated that in the following position, we have the move knight e6. And exactly how are you supposed to stop this as black? You're going to be threatening the knight, the rook, the queen, and the other rook simultaneously with the knight. Jump up to d6. So black only has a few options here, and Ding defends extremely well in this position. The best move according to the computer was to take first. Takes, and it's very counterintuitive because the knight coming to d6 now doesn't hit all three of black's pieces, but black is a little bit less coordinated, and this knight d6 coming, there are some critical problems for black. For example, after rook to d7, we can play knight d6, queen to d8, queen to d5, king to f8, queen to f5, king g8, queen e6, king to f8, and continue to improve the position with rook to d1, and maybe figure out what to do there. Maybe rook d4, f4 looks extremely strong. But Gukesh misses the way to get a concrete advantage, and that is a very difficult, very small difference to see. If one rook is traded, black has a little bit less defensive resources. We have knight to e4 also. I mean, how do you deal against this threat? Ding plays rook to f8. We have knight d6, forking the queen and the rook, but Ding has this resource of rook c7, which I think Gukesh missed. We have queen to e5, queen to f6. Ding is hoping for a queen trade. Please trade queens to alleviate all of the pressure. We have queen d5, king to h8, rook to e5, rook to e7, rook to e1, rook takes, and pawn to h6. Queen to c5, threatening the bishop, bishop to d7, knight to e4, attacking the queen, queen to f4. So white has a knight, black has the bishop, and the real question is white able to generate some threats that black will not be able to defend against? Otherwise, black is completely fine in the position, and these queenside pawns could be actually a big problem for white. We have rook to e7 attacking the bishop, bishop to f5, queen to d4, attacking the pawn on g7 and threatening checkmate. Rook to g8, pawn to h3, giving some room for the king. We have check, and king to f2. If you go back to h2, then we have this move, queen to f4 check. We have king to f2, bishop takes on e4, rook takes on e4, and pawn c3. Ding is hoping to liquidate the position and go for a draw, which makes a lot of sense. The rook on g8 is extremely passive. We also have the potential to play rook coming back to e7 or rook to a7, targeting the pawn, and we even have this move rook to e6, threatening a checkmate and the pawn on a6 at the same time. So we have pawn c3, pawn takes, king to g3, queen to b3, stopping the rook coming to e6 and also allowing the pawn to go down the board. Rook to e7, pawn to a5, rook to b7, and queen c4. Okay, in terms of these endgames, if we want to understand these endgames from how to push for a win here, it is very likely that if we get a rook endgame, it'll be a drawish position, even if white is up a pawn. But if we have a queen endgame, the queen will be able to support the pawn advance, and if white can find a way to shelter off the checks in the position, then the game will likely be in white's favor, pushing for a win. So from Ding's perspective, he wants to trade off the queens, even at the cost of potentially losing the pawn. From Gukesh's position, he would love to have the two rooks traded on the board, and we have a queen endgame where white has this passed pawn on the c-file. So Ding plays queen c4, opting for the queen trade. We have queen to e5, keeping the queens on the board. We have queen to c6, attacking the rook, and queen takes on b5. So Gukesh sees nothing better than to go for this endgame where you have an extra pawn for white, but very likely that black will be completely fine here. So I think black can play rook to a8 first, helping the pawn push down the board, and after rook to b3, a4, rook to a3. Maybe white's better here. Maybe black should have done something else. Maybe target the pawn immediately makes a lot of sense. So rook to c8, and if rook to b3, rook to c4, stopping the king from invading, and then holding onto the pawn. Probably a drawn position as well for black. But we have queen takes on c3, and Ding decides to keep the queens on the board for one more move. There's no more c-pawn for white, so there isn't that big of a threat from white's perspective. We have rook to a7, check. queen b4 takes, and after rook to b7, rook to a8 takes, we have a 3 versus 2 endgame. This is a theoretical draw. In practice, it can be tricky, and I remember winning a game with 3 versus 2, just slowly trying to figure out a way to move the king and pawns up the board, but Ding should have no problem drawing this position. After rook a2, king g3, king h7, rook b5, king g6, f4, king to f6, king to f3, rook to c2, pawn g3, rook gives check, king to g4, rook to a3. The rook is keeping an eye on the king's movements and also keeping pressure on the g3 pawn. After pawn to h4, we have rook to c3, rook gives check, king to f7, and pawn to f5. And with the rook on c3, always putting pressure on this g3 pawn, Ding finds a nice way to liquidate the game after h5. If you take, then after rook takes, the game is just a draw. And after king f4, we have check, king moves, check, king moves, check, king moves, check, and the game ends in a draw. Quite an exciting match. Gukesh playing for a win, deciding when to play concretely, when to play strategically, having some difficulty finishing these games and putting the game away, and Ding holding on for dear life, gets a draw in the position, which I'm sure he's very satisfied with. Okay, so there's one more game to go. If we have draw in the last game, then the game will go to tie breaks. And in tie breaks, I do think that Ding is a slight favorite. I've seen him play Blitz. I've seen him play Rapid. Maybe not recently, but to remember, he did play against Hikaru in the Speed Chess Championship in, I believe, 2021, and did extremely well in that fast time format, tying Hikaru all the way to the end, and it was like 15.5 to 15.5. So Ding is really a beast when it comes to Blitz, being able to keep up with Hikaru, arguably the best Blitz player of all time, except for Magnus, and depending on when they play as well. So Ding definitely a beast when it comes to faster time formats, and I think that'll give him an edge. Which means Gukesh has the black pieces tomorrow. Is he going to try to push for a win? Is he going to get completely outplayed like he did previously? We'll wait and see. I think it's going to be a very exciting game tomorrow. Anything can happen. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and I will see you in the next one.